Then he said, "What is the kingdom of God like? To what can I compare it? It is like a mustard seed that a person took and planted in the garden. When it was fully grown, it became a large bush, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches." While a mustard seed has many good uses, it is still a weed. The cedar of Lebanon is a mighty tree that could give shade to all the birds of the world. What should an empire be like, a mustard plant or the mighty, noble cedar? An empire is obviously more like the cedar of Lebanon. The parable of the mustard seed takes a complete opposite approach than the expectation of what an empire is like. It pokes fun at the idea that an empire must be a mighty thing and helps us to realize that it is quite the opposite. But for Jesus, God's empire is more pervasive than dominant. It is like a pungent weed that takes over everything and in which the birds of the air can nest. It bears little, if any, resemblance to the mighty, majestic, and noble symbol of the empire of Israel or Caesar. Leviticus 19:19 says, "You shall not let your animals breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor shall you put on a garment made of two different materials." Again, Jesus' parable of the mustard seed challenges that by saying that the kingdom of God does not just include the ones who are wealthy and successful, but the ones that are poor and cast out of society. In Jesus' life, this parable was a major challenge to many in society who believed God regarded only the wealthy and priests as his people. Using Scott's interpretation of the mustard seed parable, we were able to identify a few key themes of biblical justice. The first theme that is evident in the parable is the theme of Imago Dei, the image and likeness of God. For Jesus, God's empire is more pervasive than dominant. Instead of it being an empire that is powerful and one where God sides with the upper class, Jesus is reminding us that the kingdom of God is composed of the lower class, even more so than the upper class. By telling the story of the mustard seed, Jesus reminds us that God has extended the invitation into the kingdom of God for everyone, not just for the elite. The second example of biblical justice in the parable of the mustard seed is covenant. Jesus is relaying God's promise to everyone that we all may be a part of the kingdom of God, so long as we accept his invitation and live how he wants us to. The final theme of biblical justice that is evident in this parable is the preferential option for the poor. Jesus is clearly siding with the poor, which was a direct challenge to those in authority. Brown says that the kingdom of God is like a pungent weed that takes over everything, rather than comparing it to the mighty cedar of Lebanon. Jesus is siding with the poor by telling listeners that the kingdom of God is not about the upper class, but about those at the bottom of the social pyramid.
An example of the message of this parable on a global scale is the Citizens Commission on Civil Rights. This group is committed to the revitalization of a progressive civil rights agenda at national level. Its belief is that such an agenda benefits the entire country, not just particular groups. This group fights for the rights of all people, similar to how the kingdom of God welcomes all people, as exemplified in the mustard seed story. An example of the parable on a local scale is Misericordia, which is a community of care that maximizes the potential for people with disabilities. In 1954, Misericordia began as a very small organization. It has grown to support more than 600 children and adults today in many different locations around Chicago.
After learning more about this parable and identifying groups that exemplify its subversive message, we must reflect on our own lives. What is our image of the kingdom of God? How will you take Jesus' challenge in the parable of the mustard seed and apply it to your life?